Hello, grace and peace to you in our Lord Jesus Christ. Today I'm going to be reading from Madame Jeanne Guyon. I'll be reading from her book, The Short Method of Prayer. This is a translation from Jeanne Edwards from 1975. Jeanne Edwards was an American pastor and writer, and he gave it a new title, Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ. Madame Guyon was born in 1648 into an aristocratic family in France. She was 15 years old when she was married to a man 20 years her senior. Then by age 28, she was widowed, lost both of her parents, born 5 children, lost 2 of them, and become permanently scarred by smallpox. After her husband's death, she sought after a religious vocation and eventually became celebrated as a spiritual guide and writer. As such, she became part of the devout circle of aristocrats and clergy in the court surrounding King Louis XIV. Madame Guyon was a devout Catholic for all of her life. She was educated by nuns and influenced by people we recognize now as being part of the Catholic Reformation, most notably Francis de Sales and Madame Chantal. This short method of prayer was published in 1685. That's the same year, by the way, that Johann Sebastian Bach was born. The book was broadly distributed, then came to be considered heretical by her superiors in the church, as her method was closely associated with the teachings of Quietism. Broadly speaking, the Quietists, led by Spanish priest Michael Molinos, taught that in the believer's inner life there should be a passivism of the will that in effect favored inner repose with God at the expense of what would be considered ordinary human obligation. That may be a tidy way of expressing something that continues to elude, but it has come to be presumed now that was not what Madame Guyon was intending to teach. There were other aspects of the book that disturbed the clergy. Some people felt that her prayer of simplicity, which is the focus of the book, was essentially a kind of hypnotism, or they felt that the intimacy with Christ that she was teaching her reader to cultivate through the prayer was something that could only be experienced by people deep within the religious orders. I presume Madame Guyon to have been a very complex person, and that many people there in her circle did not know what to make of her. She did have one crucial friend, however, there in the court, and that was the Archbishop Francois Fénelon. Now, there's much to be said about Fénelon. He was a very important person, and I'm going to be saving that for a video later in the future. Fénelon was introduced to Guyon through that same little flock of devout people in the court, and eventually he engaged with her in a rich written correspondence in which she became his own spiritual guide and mentor. And he developed a deep respect and admiration for her and was confident that he understood what she was really saying, even as her words came across very clumsily to other people. He worked hard to defend her against her critics, and who included the Pope, and this got him into a lot of trouble. Now, there's an excellent book by Fénelon that came out in 2012 by Peter Gourdet, and he goes to great lengths to clarify Madame Guyon's teaching in order to describe the precise way she came to influence Fénelon so deeply. And he really brings some helpful understanding to the currents of opinion and thought at that time, and in particular to the very precarious dynamics that existed in that circle of very powerful people, very sophisticated and very colorful people. And of course, this is a scenario that's going to get very exciting and very dark just 2 generations later when the French Revolution comes around. Back to Madame Guyon. In the face of the criticism that I just described, Guyon asked that her work be examined by the superiors of the church. A council was set up by the king, and it presented to her 34 articles of Catholic teaching about the interior life. Guyon submitted to these with her signature, but there continued to be enough opposition that throughout the process things did not go well. Her teaching was considered dangerous enough in the end that she was arrested and imprisoned for 7 years. She was released from the Bastille in 1703, and she died in Blois in 1717 at her daughter's home. Madame Guyon wrote several books, and by far the most famous of them is her autobiography, and this one, A Short Method of Prayer. Both books have been a staple of influence on the Moravians, the Quakers, John Wesley, Hudson Taylor, and within the holiness movement here in the US and in England. And that would include people like Jessie Pyn Lewis, A.W. Tozer, and G.D. Watson. Madame Guyon was by no means the first person in the history of the church to write truly rapturously about the living Christ. And so I've been interested in what makes her writing so prominent among evangelicals. And I find that as I'm digesting this book about Fénelon, I'm starting to understand how she and Fénelon both began writing about the spiritual life right at the beginning of the Enlightenment, which was the time when the self and the components and the experience of the self were being objectified in a way they had never been before. It's as if we reached in and took out what we deduced to be the self and began to look at it from the outside. And this includes the way the self experienced God and related to Christ. Not only does Guyon's writing reflect this kind of examination or self-consciousness, maybe that's a better way of saying it, but perhaps it's part of the reason that so many at that time were disoriented by what she said. Yet on the other hand, we are heirs to a language that has been accommodating this objectification of the self for 4 centuries, and so we're much more at home with it. I wonder if the legacy of the book has endured not only because people like Count Zinzendorf and John Wesley were so inspired and taught by Madame Guyon, but also because language about the self and the spiritual life began to change. And perhaps that's part of the reason that this book has been particularly accessible and helpful to so many Protestant believers.